Hello and welcome back for our lecture on Chapter 11 from your textbook on caffeine. Today we're going to be talking about the primary sources of caffeine in the American diet and around the world, the pharmacology of caffeine, its mechanism of action, and then behavioral effects and health concerns rather, similar to our process with many of the other drugs that we work with this semester. One thing that's unique about this drug that we're working with this week is I'm going to own this is one I'm particularly fond of. I'm quite a coffee drinker, so caffeine is one of my personal favorite drugs. All right, so starting to dig into the information on caffeine. I'm not the only person who uses it. It is the most widely used psychoactive drug around the world. It's used by individuals around the world and actually by 85% of the American population every day. Caffeine belongs to a class of chemicals known as xanthines. The major sources in the American diet and around the world: coffee, tea, and chocolate. So you may not be used to thinking of caffeine as a dangerous drug, but if we think about our definitions, there is evidence that caffeine can cause dependence. I think some of us who are regular coffee drinkers may have some experience with that headache that you get when you don't have your cup of coffee in the morning. We can consider that a withdrawal symptom. And then some evidence that it can also interfere with normal functioning. So it does fit some of those qualifications that we've been using to classify dangerous drugs. So as I mentioned, there are three main sources: coffee, tea, and cacao or chocolate. They have been in use for thousands of years, for millennia, and they all do originate from different parts of the world. So coffee originally from the Middle East, tea originates from China, and then cacao from the Americas. So that's kind of our native source of caffeine here in the Western Hemisphere. Now, if you think about some of the history that's associated with these products, this is not strictly a food item. It's something that has played an important cultural and economic role throughout human history, and actually has continued to play throughout the modern era. We're going to start with coffee, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of the origins. This is kind of a mythological, kind of an origin story. Legend tells us that an Ethiopian goat herder and his goats were the first to eat coffee berries, and then they danced. So if you think about the effect of caffeine on the body, maybe that is our first evidence, even though maybe legend-based, our first evidence of caffeine use in human populations. The practice did spread as globalization began, and we saw coffee in use in the 1400s through Egypt and other Arabic countries, 1500s throughout the Middle East, and then in the 1600s is when it reached Europe. There was quite a cultural and social movement around coffee in the 17th and 18th century England. We saw the spread of coffee houses. There's this phrase they're referred to as penny universities. So this idea that there were places where you could go and be exposed to literary and cultural influences, political debate, that sort of thing. So that coffee house environment is not something that's unique to 21st century America. But we saw opposition to the use of caffeine begin almost immediately. So in England, by the late 1600s, we have some evidence. We have a written brochure, the Women's Petition Against Coffee. And their health concern here was actually impotence. They argued that coffee should not be commonly used because it made men impotent. And although we do have some evidence of health concerns for coffee, that is not one that's currently on the list of medical concerns. As we look at the history of coffee consumption here in the United States, we did see an increase in use after the beginnings of the American Revolution. If you think back to the Boston Tea Party, tea was highly taxed by the government of England at the time, which was, of course, the government of the United States up until the American Revolution, or the American colonies, I suppose. So after that, during the time of the Revolution and after the Tea Party, that idea of drinking tea was associated with being affiliated with England. So we saw increased consumption of coffee in response. People didn't give up caffeine, they just gave up tea. We also saw increased use of coffee during and after Prohibition. So as people gave up or were discouraged from using alcohol, they turned to coffee instead. And then we saw its highest use in 1946. That was still the highest level of recorded caffeine consumption in the United States. And we think that this may be, this decline in coffee use may be because of increased soda consumption. So as caffeinated beverages of other kinds became more popular, we saw less use of coffee here in the United States. Current annual estimates, about 23 gallons of coffee per year per person. So we do enjoy our coffee here in the United States. In terms of how coffee is processed and stored, like many of the drugs that we've talked about this semester, originally there was very little processing involved in the use of the drug. Our earliest uses of caffeine indicate that people would just chew on the coffee beans or they'd put the raw beans in hot water. So not a lot of processing or storage involved in that process. But as the use of coffee spread, it was discovered that roasting improved the flavor. And when the coffee house movement spread, we saw that people would have their individualized methods of roasting and grinding and that sort of thing, and it became part of what drew a particular group to a particular coffee house. We saw our first evidence of commercial roasting for others in the late 1700s in New York, here in the United States. And then in 1900, vacuum packing for long-term storage of ground coffee. So ground coffee is perishable, and before this it needed to be ground closer to the time of consumption. But when vacuum packing became available, then we saw the ability for coffee to be ground ahead of time and then distributed. And this is around the same time, of course, that we saw that period of industrialization affecting the processing and distribution of many drugs, as well as coffee. In terms of coffee growing and trade, trade and cultural influences, we saw the beginnings of this in 1696. This is when the Dutch began cultivation in the East Indies, and that is when Latin America became the largest source of coffee. You kind of associate coffee with that part of the world now, but that was actually developed in 1696 for the purposes of trade. So virtually all coffee comes from these two species, Arabica and Robusta. So Arabica is a milder flavor. It does take longer to grow and it grows in more specific areas. And then Robusta, stronger and a bit more bitter, and also more, as the name may indicate, more robust, easier to grow. It's got a higher caffeine content, and it's used in less expensive types of coffee. So if you see that on your coffee source, 100% Arabica beans, it's speaking to the quality of the coffee that's included, or the coffee bean that's included in the particular coffee that you're purchasing. Right now, about half of the coffee that we consume here in the United States does come from Latin America. The other half, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. In terms of the economic cost of our coffee habit here in the United States, we did import over $5 billion worth of coffee in 2008. So it does have cultural importance to this day. Now we do run into decaffeinated coffee, so having the hot beverage without the caffeine, without the drug included. And there's a couple of different processes that are used to remove that caffeine. The first one occurs before roasting, and this is the most commonly used one. So the unroasted beans are soaked in an organic solvent that removes the caffeine. This is what's most commonly used. There is an alternative water process, but it is not as popular. People report that it removes more of the flavor of the coffee, so it doesn't involve that solvent process. It's just water-based, but it doesn't leave as much of the coffee flavor behind once the caffeine is removed. And in terms of where that caffeine goes, the caffeine that comes from the coffee then gets reused in soft drinks. So one of the largest decaffeinating plants in the world is actually owned by Coca-Cola. So it's taken out of the coffee and added to the soda. And if you think about that process we talked about, where Americans started drinking less coffee and more soft drinks, you can see how that could contribute to the production of the soft drink process there. Now, of course, many of us here in the United States no longer drink straight up coffee. We now drink different kinds of coffee drinks. Our favorite order from a coffee shop may take a couple minutes to fully describe. But we've got our espressos, cappuccinos, lattes, frappuccinos, lots of different options, half-calf flavored, iced. The part of this is driven by the availability of the drinks, of course. And we did see a real cultural kind of return to that coffee house idea here in the United States over the past couple of decades. With the spread of Starbucks and similar organizations, we're now up to 25,000, over 25,000 specialty coffee shops in the U.S., when a couple of decades ago there were only 200 that were participating in the biggest trade group. So we do see a real change in cultural priority for coffee and consumption of coffee. And then we've also got some health concerns about the large amounts of sugars that are also consumed when people consume those specialty coffee drinks. If you would like to, if you've never checked the calorie content of your favorite coffee-based beverage, you may want to go ahead and check that out. Now, we talk about the amount of caffeine that's actually in coffee. This is going to depend on how the coffee is prepared. These are based on 5-ounce cups, which is much smaller than the portions that most of us are used to consuming. And this is in milligrams. So our straight up brewed drip coffee, 115 milligrams in 5 ounces, all the way down to instant decaf, which would only have 2. So decaffeination, just for the record, does remove most of the caffeine. And it definitely would remove enough caffeine that people would not feel the effects of the caffeine, but it doesn't remove all of the caffeine from the beverage. We'll wrap up here with our first mini lecture on caffeine, and we'll be back to talk about tea and its role in caffeine delivery and also social and economic history.